Welcome back, everyone. We're going to head into the second part of our first lecture. So we're talking about sex and gender. So this is going to be largely based off of the discussion that we had in class. So this should be hopefully mostly review for you and a few extra interesting additional pieces. So this class is called Human Sexual Biology, and what you'll see is that we're going to be pretty precise about how we use language in this course. So what are humans? Hopefully, I think we're all on the same page there, so I'm just going to kind of skip past that one. So what is biology? So biology is the science or the study of living things, so we're pretty clear on that. But then sex, right? So then the question becomes, well, what is sex and what do we mean when we say the word sex or sexual? So as we discussed in class, there's a lot of different potential meanings for this. So one of the first ones that comes to mind, of course, for everybody is sex as a human behavior. So things that you engage in, normally meant to be pleasurable, often involving the genitals, may or may not be for the purposes of reproduction. Right, and there's a huge variety of behaviors, right? So there's the kind of classic intercourse types of sex, so vaginal and anal sex, then there's oral sex, and so remember the terminology here, the official terminology is that cunnilingus is for oral vulvar contact. I'm pretty picky about language, as I mentioned, so usually oral sex is contact with the vulva, not the vagina, although it can be as well. Fellatio, which would be, like a blowjob, oral penile contact, and analingus. Outer course is the word that's used to refer to just kind of rubbing genitals against each other without actual intercourse. And touching, so kind of digital sex, touching somebody else's body parts, is referred to as mutual masturbation, which is not the term I would have picked because then I just kind of imagine two people laying there side by side, each one of them masturbating. And that's not what they mean. They mean touching somebody else. So if you see that term, that's what that's referring to. And then, of course, kissing, other types of touching, and masturbation, and lots of things that people can engage in under that category of sex. So we also talked about how sex can be referring as a shorthand to what kind of body do you have, right? What body parts do you have? What are your characteristics? What organs are present or not present, right? So if you go to a doctor's office and the form says sex, right, they're not asking if you want to have any, they're asking you for that shorthand of what type of body characteristics you have. So that's sex as biologic gender, or your body characteristics. And so that's where this concept of biologic sexual dimorphism comes in. Di means two, morph means shape. So this idea that there are two kind of different body shapes and configurations that you can have. One is male and one is female, right? So there's kind of two different styles that a human being comes in, right? Some of these differences are related to reproductive organs themselves, but some are related to other features of the body, as we'll talk about in a minute. It's often treated as a very binary thing, you're one or the other, but as we'll see in this talk, as well as when we kind of go into it in more in depth next week, we'll see that this is actually on a continuum and there's lots of overlap and in between spaces. But it's often kind of shorthand, we think of it in that binary either or, male or female. So here are some cardinals. They're a type of bird that is known for their biologic sexual dimorphism. The male of the species is brightly red colored, and the female of the species is kind of a dun brown or a bit of a gray color. So very obvious physical differences, which as you can see, have nothing to do with their reproductive systems for this when we look at the color differential. All right, what about in humans, right? Enough about birds and the bees, right? So what about humans? So we talked about what are the differences in the bodies we see between someone who is stereotypically male-bodied versus stereotypically female-bodied. And we kind of went through all of the differences we could think of. Oh yeah. So if you put them all kind of together, and I know this chart is really busy and I don't expect you to memorize it, but I want to point out a couple of things in terms of how we can think about these different body features. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is is something a primary sex characteristic or is it a secondary sex characteristic? The difference between the two is a primary sex characteristic is something that's there right the moment that you're born, right? So it has to do with what chromosomes you have, what hormones you have, what types of gonads you have. They could be ovaries or they could be testes when we think in a binary fashion, although sometimes they're a little bit of each because Mother Nature. What types of genitals do you have? And what types of internal reproductive organs do you have, right? So in a traditional female-bodied person, it's XX chromosome, male is XY. Female hormones are usually estrogen and progesterone, male it's testosterone primarily. Ovaries versus testes, vagina and vulva versus penis and scrotum, and then the uterus and fallopian tubes versus things like the vas deferens and the prostate gland and things that you probably don't even really know what they are yet, but we'll get there. The secondary sex characteristics are things that develop over time. So if you think about when you see children and they're clothed and you can't see their anatomy, sometimes it can be very difficult to tell the difference between a male-bodied and a female-bodied child because they haven't yet developed those secondary sex characteristics. So these are the things that become apparent at puberty under the influence of increasing levels of sex hormones. So we start to see a difference in terms of height. So eventually, when they reach their adult height, in general, males of the human species are taller than females. The facial features of the male of the species tend to be more angular, right? A more pronounced jaw and brow and forehead, whereas female-bodied people tend to have a smoother and more rounded facial structure. Facial hair is usually not common in female-bodied people, although it varies a lot depending on your race, ethnicity, and your genetic heritage, right? But it can often be quite significant in many male-bodied people, although not all of them, right? Tracheal cartilage, that refers to the Adam's apple, that pronounced bit of cartilage present in the throat. So tracheal cartilage, or the Adam's apple, is usually relatively subtle in female-bodied people and more prominent in male-bodied. Musculature, so testosterone is an anabolic steroid. It just happens to be a naturally produced one, and it does result in increased muscle strength and bulk. So we tend to see a difference in musculature. There's also a difference in the width of the pelvis, right? So female-bodied people, and this happens later in development, it's not present right away at birth. Female-bodied people tend to develop a wider pelvis, which is fortunate because of the whole childbirth thing, which we'll get to later. Male-bodied people is narrower, and generally in female-bodied people, the breast tissues become developed, and in male-bodied people, they typically don't. So again, to remind you, these are generalizations and simplifications. There's a lot of overlap, right? There are lots of female-bodied people who have prominent jaws and male-bodied people who don't have facial hair, right? But these are kind of general broad categorizations. So just a reminder that there's lots of overlap between the two. It's not strictly one or the other. And that holds true not just for humans, but also for animals. So this was a fun news story. A woman in Pennsylvania caught a photograph of a cardinal, and I just thought it was fun because I used cardinals earlier, that is what's called a gynandromorph. So gyn, G-Y-N, means female, andro, A-N-D-R-O, means male, morph means shape, right? So this cardinal, as you can see, is part red and part brown. So it has a little bit of the male traditional coloring and some of the female. Kind of cool, right? Nature likes to mix things up. So far, just remind ourselves of what we were talking about. We're talking about interpretations and definitions of the word sex. So it could be a human behavior, or we could be referring to a set of your body characteristics, chromosomes, hormones, body parts, internal, external, reproductive, and other. Or sex could actually be referring to a method of reproduction. So you'd be like, oh, isn't that the same as the behavior? Well, not necessarily, because when we talk about sex as a method of reproduction, what we mean is that some of the genetic material, DNA, chromosomes, from one individual is going to combine with the genetic material from another individual, and they're going to come together to form a totally new, unique individual who has never existed before. And so obviously, that's why, your parents have children, and some of them have dad's nose, and some of them have mom's eyes, right? You get a little bit of genetic information from each of the parents to combine a new whole. But that's not unique to humans. There are actually lots of other types of living organisms that use sexual reproduction. So animals tend to do it often, kind of similarly to us. It's combined with that particular behavior that they may engage in. But plants also reproduce sexually through their pollen. So pollen is kind of like the semen for plants, which, think about that next time you see a big cloud of pollen wafting through. It's trees having sex with you, or trying to. So plants do this, right? And so they combine pollen from one plant, and it kind of goes onto the pistil of another plant. So you have this genetic information from two different individual organisms that combines, right? So if you've ever grown blueberries, you have to have two different types of bushes in order to ever get berries, because you can't mate with yourself if you're a blueberry. So sexual reproduction is often posited as opposed to asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is like, I'm good. I don't need anybody else's genetic material. I'm just going to make more of me because I am fabulous, right? That is asexual reproduction. It's basically cloning. And we do see that in some species. So what hopefully you can see in the animation right now is some bacteria. And the way bacteria grow and reproduce is by just making exact copies of themselves, right? Because they're marvelous as they are. So this is a different type of reproductive strategy. All right, so this is just the explanation of that material, right? So sexual reproduction, you're taking genetic material from two different individuals, combining it into a new whole. And this allows for a lot of variety, right? So this can be a real strategy to give you an evolutionary advantage, as opposed to asexual, where you just copy yourself. It's really efficient, it's really quick, but you don't have the opportunity to kind of mix things up quite as much. All right, so in summary, sex could be your biologic sex, which is your body parts and chromosomes and hormones. It could be referring to a method of reproduction, or it could be referring to an actual human behavior. So there's three different possible interpretations of the word sex, and we're going to need to be really specific in this course as to what we're talking about. So anytime we talk about sex, people also talk about gender, and that's because these two concepts are interwoven. But again, we're going to be really specific about what we mean. So let's talk about what you could mean when you use the word gender by itself, right? And when we use it in this course, we're going to specify what aspect of gender we're talking about. So you could be referring to biologic sex, right? So the thing we've just been talking about. So gender, right? That's sometimes what's on those forms, and what they're asking for is what body type do you have? So we've already discussed that, but sometimes the word gender is used to refer to that same thing. We could also be talking about your gender identity. And there's no picture I can use to show this, because this is something that's inside and invisible. So this is your internal sense of self as being male or female or something in between, or different or not gendered at all. And if you're somebody whose gender identity matches your biologic sex, and they kind of go together, it may not have occurred to you that this is actually a separate thing. So this can be really a difficult concept. Like, what do you mean your sense of what you are? But in fact, for some people, it doesn't totally match up with their biologic sex, and so they're very aware that this is its own distinct thing, right? Because sometimes it doesn't kind of match or line up with your biologic gender. So I'm gonna do a little story time now and read an excerpt from the book called She's Not There by Jenny Finney Boylan. All right, here we go. One day when I was about 3, I was sitting in a pool of sunlight cast onto the wooden floor beneath my mother's ironing board. I saw her ironing my father's white shirt, a sprinkle of water from her blue plastic bottle, a short spurt of steam as it sizzled beneath the iron. "Someday you'll wear shirts like this," said Mom. I just listened to her strange words, as if they were a language other than English. I didn't understand what she was getting at. She never wore shirts like that. Why would I ever be wearing shirts like my father's? Since then, the awareness that I was in the wrong body, living the wrong life, was never out of my conscious mind. Never. Although my understanding of what it meant to be a boy or a girl was something that changed over time. Still, this conviction was present during my piano lesson with Mr. Hockenberry, and it was there when my father and I shot off model rockets, and it was there years later when I took the SAT, and it was there years later in the middle of the night when I woke in my dormitory at Wesleyan. And at every moment as I lived my life, I countered this awareness with an exasperated companion thought, namely, don't be an idiot. You're not a girl. Get over it. But I never got over it. I did not know the word transsexual back then, and the word transgendered had not yet been invented. I had heard the word transvestite, of course, but it didn't seem to apply to me. It sounded kind of creepy, like some kind of centipede or grub. In my mind, I sometimes confused it with the words that described cave formations. What was it again? Transvestites grew down from the top of the cave. Transvestmites grew up from the bottom. But even if I had known the right definitions for these words, I'm not sure it would have made much of a difference to me. Even now, a discussion of transgender people frequently resembles nothing so much as a conversation about aliens. Do you think there really are transgender people? Has the government known about them for years and is keeping the whole business secret? Where do they come from, and what do they want? Have they been secretly living among us for years? Although my understanding of the difference between men and women evolved as I grew older, as a child I knew enough about my condition to know it was something I'd better keep private. This conviction had nothing to do with a desire to be feminine, but it had everything to do with being female, which is an odd belief for a person born male. It certainly had nothing to do with whether I was attracted to girls or boys. This last point was the one that years later would most frequently elude people. But being gay or lesbian is about sexual orientation. Being transgender is about identity. What it's also emphatically not is a lifestyle, any more than being male or female is a lifestyle. When I imagine a person with a lifestyle, I see a millionaire playboy named Chip who likes to race yachts, or an accountant perhaps, who dresses up in suit of armor on the weekends. Being transgender isn't like that. Gender is many things, but one thing it is surely not is a hobby. Being female is not something you do because it's clever or postmodern, or because you're a deluded, deranged narcissist. In the end, what it is more than anything else is a fact. It is the dilemma of the transgender person, however, that it is a fact that cannot possibly be understood without imagination. After I grew up and lived as female, people would often ask me, "How did you know when you were a child? How is it possible that you could believe with such heartbroken conviction something which on the surface of it seems so stupid?" This question always baffled me, as I could hardly imagine what it was like not to know what your gender was. It seemed obvious to me that this was something you understood intuitively, not on the basis of what was between your legs, but because of what you felt in your heart. Remember when you woke up this morning, I'd say to my female friends, and you knew you were female? That's how I felt. That's how I knew. So that is Jenny's description of her gender identity, right? And coming to realize that. So I hope you enjoyed that. I think it's a powerful piece. So if somebody is transgender, what we're meaning then is that their gender identity, just like Jenny's, doesn't kind of match or feel congruent with or go along with what we would stereotypically accept for somebody with that biologic sex or biologic gender with that particular body type. So we use this word in contrast to cisgender. Cis as a prefix means kind of going along with, and that would be somebody whose gender identity is congruent with or kind of matches up with their biologic gender, which is often called the sex assigned at birth or gender assigned at birth, right? Because you're born and the doctor says it's a boy or it's a girl, right? Okay. So we're talking about gender now. So we've talked about two elements of gender that we might be referring to your biologic sex, or we could be talking about gender identity. And the third possible thing we could be talking about is your gender expression. So remember, gender expression is how we communicate our gender to the world around us. We oftentimes do this through clothing and accessories, right? So you could be masculine, you could be feminine, oh, Nikki, sorry, or you could be kind of in between or neither, which we would call androgynous. And there you see those words again, andro, male, gyne, female, right? So stereotypically masculine gender expression right here. So we're seeing a lot of muscles, athleticism, rugged individualism, the working professional or CEO, motorcycles, right? You could come up with a lot of pictures, I think, to add to this. And then stereotypically feminine gender expression, we see a lot of pink and lace and ruffles and flowers and long flowy hair and makeup, jewelry, right? Pretty typical feminine gender expression. And then there's the androgynous, or that kind of in-between space where you're kind of mixing it up a little bit. So far, what I've shown you in terms of gender expression are things that have to do with your appearance. So things that you intentionally do. So what do you wear? How do you style your hair? Do you wear makeup? Do you not? What kind of jewelry do you wear? How much of it do you wear? Under what circumstances, right? So these are intentional choices that we get to make. And so when we think about clothing especially, right, it's really fun to look and see that our current cultural understandings of what is appropriate feminine or masculine clothing is a little bit different from what is true in other regions and in other times in the world, right? So kilts in Scotland are a great example, right? So kind of men in skirts, that's not what we would typically see in our society. And for anybody who watches Outlander, there's Jamie Fraser, who is kind of held up as a paragon of masculinity in those books and in that TV show. And here we have Henry VIII, who was kind of like the ubermensch of his day. You could not be more masculine than King Henry VIII. And yet here he is in a skirt and tights and with some bling too. So, so obviously this is something that changes over time. In fact, I think Napoleon Bonaparte kind of invented jeggings here, right? So we can see him wearing very tightly fit pants, which must not have been easy in that day back before spandex. So these things change over time. Here's an example of a young child, I think about 2 or 3 years old in this picture. And so what we see is somebody in a ruffly dress and kind of those classic Mary Jane patent leather shoes and a frilly hat and long hair. So looking through today's lens, we would say this is a little girl. Well, actually, it turns out that this is Franklin Roosevelt. Oh, and I'm in the way and I can't move him. That's Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a child, right? So it used to be common for children to be dressed like this, right? So this is, these cultural determinations of gender expression are really fascinating and they can change over time. So it's interesting too that in the early part of the 20th century, so the early 1900s, pink was actually felt to be an appropriate color for little boys because they felt like red was a stronger, more masculine color, so pink would be appropriate for little boys, right? Baby men. And blue had lots of associations with the Virgin Mary and being virginal and pure and motherly, and so blue was often thought of as a feminine color. So that's another thing that has changed significantly over time. Even high heels, they were first worn by men, and then women started wearing them, and then the guys were like, you've ruined it for us, now we're gonna have to do something else, right? So again, these things change over time. Our possessions can signal gender to the world around us, right? So when you look at holiday gift guides, right, these are the gifts for him, these are the gifts for her, right? His are all kind of tech and weapons and tools and black, right? And hers tend to be more colorful and flowery and maybe for cooking or eating or doing other things like that. What about behaviors? So we communicate our gender not just in terms of the things that we choose to wear and accessorize with. We also communicate our behaviors subconsciously or unconsciously, often for many of us, because we just kind of learn this behavior over time, in terms of our posture and our body language. So I love this album cover because I'm a child of the 70s anyway. But so you see here, right, this is the album for Macho Man, and all of these guys are kind of facing front on to the camera. Their elbows are away from their bodies, right, and their knees and their legs are apart, right? This is a very kind of confident, almost confrontational kind of stance. This is a very traditional masculine posture. On the other hand, the traditional feminine posture is to be a little bit off to the side, right? Little head tilt, arms and elbows in, knees, legs crossed together, right? A much more kind of diminutive, passive posture. And these are things that we kind of just subconsciously learn to mimic and do over time. Tone and pitch of voice is really interesting, so I'm going to start doing something that maybe I did it in class already, so I apologize for the repetition, but I'm going to start exaggerating something, and pretty soon you'll kind of pick up on it, and you might start to notice that at the end of every sentence, my voice goes up a little bit. It's almost like everything I say is a question, like I'm not sure of myself. That's a typically feminine way of speaking, right? Whereas if I keep my pitch the same, or even go down at the end of my sentences, it's a much more authoritative way of speaking. It's actually quite difficult for me to do, right? So, and then how assertive or passive are you in conversation or in a variety of circumstances, right? So our behaviors can also communicate gender in some interesting ways, either intentionally or not. Gender roles, right? So these are behaviors we engage in, right? Who takes out the garbage? Who fixes the car? Who stays home with the kids? Who makes dinner? Who does the grocery shopping? All of these types of gendered behaviors that we tend to see. And of course, there's no reason that, you know, the women can't take out the garbage, of course, right? But we just kind of have some of these stereotypically ingrained habits, right? These are kind of cultural habits of who does what. Gives us a little shorthand. We don't have to discuss it, and we just automatically know what our role is supposed to do. And that's one of the reasons why these things tend to persist. They have some utility, but they don't work all the time, and they're often not appropriate. And so we got to mix it up a little. So careers is another way that we see a lot of gender differences. And you can think about this in terms of it being a gender role. So often more kind of caretaking positions are thought to be more feminine, right? So that is why in nursing, we don't see generally a lot of male nurses. There's no reason why men aren't good nurses, and many of them are, right? And this is in the medical field. They have to know a lot of information and be really expert in it, right? But we don't see a whole lot of men choosing nursing as a career. Similarly, we don't see a lot of women in firefighting or law enforcement. There's no reason why a woman can't be authoritative and daring and courageous, right? But we often don't tend to see it quite so much. So is this something that's due to the fact that you have XX or XY chromosomes, or that you have estrogen versus testosterone, or that your brain is different, right? Is there something about your biologic gender that determines your personality, right? Or is this just how you choose to express your gender because you identify with that gender and you've been told women should behave like this, right? So this whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of idea that we have very different personality types, right? So the quote that you can't see because I'm there, oh, I'll turn me off. Can I turn me off? No, I'm not savvy enough to do that. Wait. I can't do it, sorry. So the quote is, "I know I have the stomach of a weak, feeble woman." Or no, I'm sorry, "I know I have the mind of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." And that is Queen Elizabeth, her famous talk as her Navy is fighting off the Spanish Armada. Yes, so this idea that women are supposed to be meek and feeble and weak, is there really any truth to that? I mean, yeah, we don't have testosterone, so the muscle development isn't quite as much in general, but, right, what's going on there? So this question becomes, are these gender roles and personality traits innate, meaning that it's just something integral to how you are, it's how you're built, you're born this way? Or is it something that is learned behavior, right? Is this something that you were just kind of taught or socialized or acculturated into, either consciously or unconsciously, because of the expectations and role models to which you were exposed? So some of our best data on this question comes from Margaret Mead, and she was a cultural anthropologist who traveled to Oceania and especially Papua New Guinea, which is near Australia, in case you're not sure where that is. And there she found some cultures of people that really had had no contact with outside cultures, with the Western world at all. And so it was a pretty amazing opportunity to study their cultures and learn from them. And she was really interested in this question of how much of our personality and the gender roles that we tend to fall into is culturally constructed, meaning learned behavior, or is it just part of who men and women are naturally? Is it inborn? So there's a lot of good information in the textbook about this, but to kind of put it in summary, so in New Guinea, she found these three different civilizations, these three different kind of communities that were completely geographically isolated from each other. They had not had any contact with each other or with outside cultures until Margaret Mead arrived. And so the Arapash, the Mundugamor, and the Chambuli. And so she was interested in looking at seeing, you know, what members of the tribe were kind of aggressive and assertive and very sexual, which in our culture would be masculine, and which members of the tribe were kind of more docile or peaceful and nurturing, which in our culture would be stereotypically feminine. And so what she found was that the Arapash, which were a very peaceful tribe, both women and men participated equally in child rearing and hunting and the gathering of food as well as the hunting. They were all pretty chill and lovely, and so they were all docile and nurturing, both the women and the men. The Mundugamor were a very warlike tribe, so both the women and the men were very aggressive, very violent, and it didn't matter, there was not a significant difference between the two biologic genders in terms of their behavior. They were also very sexual, had lots of partners, and that was kind of a status symbol. And the Chambuli were the opposite of what we would typically see in a Western society. So the women in that society were very aggressive, very sexual, and the men tended to be more docile and nurturing. And she talked about how the men were very prone to gossiping with each other, and they were very interested in personal ornamentation, so fashioning beads or feathers or other things to be jewelry to kind of ornament themselves. So it's pretty interesting to see how a lot of these behaviors and personality traits that we tend to just chalk up to, oh, it's because he's a boy, or oh, it's because she's a girl, actually is probably more because he or she was taught to behave that way, or that type of behavior was modeled for them and expected of them. Pretty interesting. Okay, so we have tons of societal influences that are constantly giving us messages in our society about what's appropriate for a male-bodied person versus a female-bodied person. So there are 3 movie trailers here. And this is your first extra credit assignment, is you can watch one of these 3, and they're all available for streaming through the library's video streaming service called Canopy. And, excuse me, soda. And you can submit a 1 to 2 page reflection paper on that due by Sunday the 20th. The first one there, Like a Girl, is actually an advertisement, which hopefully I will have had time to show you in class. All right. So another example of kind of social and cultural determination of behaviors and expectations. So true or false, boys are better at math than girls. And so right now there are probably lots of female-bodied people and some male-bodied people too are probably indignantly saying, oh, poppycock, that's not true. The answer is it actually depends on how you test it. So what's interesting is that some tests do show that boys perform better on math tests than girls. But here are the conditions under which we see that pattern. And if these conditions are not present, we don't see that pattern. It's really fun. I mean, not fun, it's really kind of horrible, but it's interesting. So we see more inequity between girls and boys' math scores in countries where the genders are less equally treated. So if you're in a society where women are kind of repressed and don't have a lot of power or independence or authority, then the women and the girls in that society perform more poorly on math tests than boys. We also see that if the teacher who is grading the test, if they know the gender of the person taking the test, the boys' scores end up higher than the girls. So I don't know if you've ever been in the position where you've actually graded somebody's paper, but sometimes, even with math, sometimes it's a little, and you have to like, should I give them the benefit of the doubt and give them full credit, or should I take off for that, right? And so there can be this unconscious bias, right, of like, oh, this is Jason's paper, I'm sure he meant to say such and such, and so I'll give him partial credit, versus this is Susie's paper and I don't think she gets it, right? So if the person grading the test knows the gender of the test taker, the boys' scores will end up higher than the girls' scores. However, if the teacher is totally blinded, right, if you gave all the boys, I don't know, pink pens to write with and all the girls blue pens to write with, you know, then you don't see a difference. The other thing that's interesting is you can see some inequity if you ask, or you can see the inequity disappear if you ask girls to imagine that they are men. So they did this really great experiment at a college where they had a group of students coming in for some psychological survey. And they said to them, hey, the person doing this is running late. While you're waiting, can you just help out this math tutor center and just do this math quiz for us, right? But I screwed that up. Sorry. First, they did the psychological thing. They were told, imagine you are. And so they were given one of two scenarios to imagine. So either imagine you are a soccer mom. You're in your mid-40s, you drive a minivan, you're picking up the kids from soccer practice, you're going to get home and make them dinner, and then blah, blah, blah. And people were told it was an exercise to see how well they could kind of imagine themselves as someone else. Or they were told to imagine, okay, you're a businessman, you're headed to your office, you're carrying your briefcase, you get a cup of coffee on the way, you head into your office and sit down at your computer. And then when the students, after they finished imagining themselves in one of those two scenarios, then they said, hey, by the way, can you just do this math thing for us? The male college students performed the same on the math tests, no matter what scenario they had imagined previously. The female-bodied college students, however, when they were asked first to imagine themselves as kind of that soccer mom, they scored significantly lower on the math quiz than when they were asked first to imagine themselves as a successful businessman. Right? So depending on kind of what you're thinking. Also, when you tell girls that the math test you're giving them doesn't at all test their ability, it just tests whether or not they've seen that type of problem before, then they perform just as well as the boys. So this is called stereotype threat, which is this kind of like internalized stereotype that actually impairs your ability to perform. Like it's a real thing. So societal and cultural influences have a huge impact on not just gender expression, but also personality and how we perform in the world. Okay, so gender expression, that's the summary. It can be your appearance, your behavior, your roles, maybe your personality. Seems like a lot of it probably isn't. Seems like most of this is probably culturally constructed and learned. So we've talked about sex and gender thus far, and those are kind of our three different meanings of the word sex and our two different meanings of the word gender. I left off gender identity. I'm not sure why. Oh, there it is, that internal sense of self. Okay, but what we haven't talked about yet is sexuality, which is a little bit different from sex. So sexuality is a little bit different. So in this course, when we talk about sexuality, we are talking about in what ways is someone sexual. So that has two components to it. The first is, what do you want to do? Like, what kinds of feelings do you have, right? Are you very, what's the term, thirsty, right? Do you have very high libido? Are you very desirous? And what types of things do you desire to do and with whom, right? So in terms of your desires, how do you feel is part of your sexuality, and then what you actually do is part of your sexuality, which may or may not have a close relationship to what you want to do, right? There's what you want to do and what you actually do. So what types of behaviors with whom and under what circumstances, and we'll talk about regulation of sexual behavior later in the course, and it gets pretty interesting. So I just want to point out that to whom you are attracted, right, that's part of your desires, that's part of how you feel. That little subset of sexuality is what we're talking about when we talk about sexual orientation. Okay, so it's just a little tiny subset of your sexuality. And so this sexual orientation is talking about to whom are you attracted? What types of people, body types, genders, it all gets really confusing because there's lots of different things that are tied up in that. And but we tend to, in our society, often reduce it to biologic gender. And if you're attracted to people who have the opposite biologic gender or biologic sex from you, we call that heterosexual. Hetero means different from or straight. And if it's somebody who is the same biologic gender, we use the term homosexual. Homo means same as, or gay and lesbian. If you're like, hey, right, people, we might use the term bisexual, or if you say it doesn't matter at all what their biologic gender is, then oftentimes we'll use the word pansexual for that. Or sometimes you're not really just attracted to anybody. You're not very sexually interested at all, and that would be asexual. A as a prefix means without. So if we put it all together, we have these three different overarching concepts. So we started with sex, and sex could be referring to your behaviors, a method of reproduction where you combine your genetic material, or your body parts like your biologic sex, your biologic gender, right? So those are three different meanings of the word sex. Then we talked about gender, and there's three different meanings of the word gender too. We could be referring back to that biologic sex or biologic gender, those body parts and characteristics, or we could be talking about gender identity, or we could be talking about gender expression, which is those ways that you communicate your gender to the world through clothing, behavior, all those types of things. And then finally, we have sexuality, which again could be your behaviors, the things you do, which is another meaning of the word sex, or your desires, right? So in terms of your overall libido, attractions, and sexual orientation. So you can see why when we talk about sex, gender, and sexuality, people get really confused because there's lots of overlapping concepts here. So in this course, we're going to try to be really specific on what we're talking about so that we can all stay on the same page. This is just another way to kind of represent that if you don't like the brackets, right? You can see the overlapping circles, right? We have these kind of different meanings for these words with lots of overlap between them. All right, that's the end of this lecture. I look forward to seeing you in class, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.